Now, as I explained the supply side policies in the last video, and as I gave you some specific examples of some of the supply side policies, such as increased education and increased health of the population or increased infrastructure development, as I took you through all of these different examples, I stressed this point that all of these supply side policies, they are difficult and they are costly and they take a lot of time before they become effective. But once your supply side policies become successful and they become effective, then what they can achieve is really something special. And to see what is so special about these supply side policies, let us just start off by assuming that our economy initially is in an equilibrium where it is producing Y star GDP at the price level of PL star. Now, if supply side policies take effect, become successful, and what it means is that your aggregate supply, as we have learned, will increase, it will shift to the right. And when that happens, then this model of ADAS is telling us that your country's GDP will increase, that is, employment will increase, output will increase, and therefore we say there would be economic growth. This increase in GDP, it is known as economic growth. On the other hand, as you move to this new equilibrium, the price levels will also fall. That is, you will control inflation in your economy, price levels will fall, and you will also achieve economic growth. Now, this is special because you see, you can also use demand side policies to either achieve economic growth or to control price levels and therefore inflation. But with demand side policies, you can't achieve both of these things at the same time. Now, to see what I mean, let me draw another assumed equilibrium, and let's assume that we have another economy here who is initially at equilibrium Y star and the price levels, let's assume a PL star. What I'm saying here is that if you want to achieve this increase in GDP, increase of output, in this economic growth, you can do that by trying to use expansionary monetary, expansionary fiscal policies, the demand side policies. And expansionary monetary fiscal policy would mean that your aggregate demand would increase, it would shift to the right, and when that happens, your equilibrium will move to this new point where, yes, your GDP will increase. So that is where we are saying you can achieve economic growth through using demand side policy as well. But the problem is that as you move from this point to this new equilibrium and achieve economic growth through this demand side policy, you see, you will have to suffer from increase in price levels. You will have to suffer from inflation. That is, if you try to move this economic indicator, your GDP, in the right direction, if you try to achieve economic growth through this demand side policy, then your price levels, they will move in the wrong direction. You can only achieve economic growth at the expense of suffering from some inflation if you use your demand side policy. Whereas here, through a supply side policy, you see, you are achieving economic growth as well as controlling inflation. Now, the other point, the other way, the other thing is also correct. If you try to control inflation through demand side policy, then you are again able to do that, but then you will have to suffer from shrinking economy, a contraction of your GDP. Now we can show that in this third diagram over here. So let us again assume that the economy is initially starting with GDP Y star, price levels PL star. Now if you want to lower these price levels using demand side policy, then you will have to implement contractionary monetary and contractionary fiscal policy. You will have to shift your aggregate demand to the left. When that happens, yes, at this new equilibrium, the price levels will fall, so you will control for inflation. But at this new equilibrium, your GDP will fall, it will become less than what it was. So you will have a contraction of GDP. Your GDP will move in the wrong direction as you try to control inflation. Now, this is where we say that in these demand side policies, there is always going to be a conflict. You can control either economic growth and GDP or inflation and price levels. You can't move both the things, the GDP and the price levels. You can't move both of them in the right direction at the same time. There is going to be this conflict, so policymakers, they will have to choose how much of economic growth at the expense of how much inflation they are willing to go for. Or if they are trying to control inflation in the economy, they have to sort of find the right balance at, okay, how much inflation are we going to control at the expense of how much contraction in the economy. And this is where we are saying supply side policies, they are special. They don't have this conflict. If you are successful in implementing supply side policies, if you are successful in increasing the country's potential output and increasing the country's aggregate supply, then basically you are expanding the capacity of the economy. You are expanding the ability of the economy to make more goods, to produce more things. So there would be more employment, there would be more GDP, and the prices would also stay under control. And that is exactly what our model of ADAS is showing us. Increase the aggregate supply, use supply side policies, increase your GDP and control your price levels. Do both the things at the same time. So in this way, you can say that the supply side policies sort of win over demand side policies. But still you have to remember that, look, both supply side and demand side policies, they have their own place within macroeconomic management. They are used for different purposes. The supply side policy, yes, it moves your GDP and price levels both in the right direction, but the supply side policies, remember, we are talking here about long-term things, where you are trying to increase the quantity, quality of country's resources, the state of technology. You are trying to increase the country's potential output and therefore shift the aggregate supply to the right. So you are sort of talking here about, the policymakers' 10 years, 15 years, 20 years visions and plans as to where they want to see their economy and the way they want to increase the potential of their economy over the long run. And ultimately, when the supply side policies succeed, yes, you get this beautiful result. On the other hand, these demand side policies, yes, they are sort of weaker in the sense that they have this conflict, but at least they give you some control over either price levels or GDP, and they can work quickly. So these demand side policies, this monetary fiscal policy, think of it as a live action. This is what actually most of the policymakers are actually really on a daily basis busy with and concerned with, using these demand side policies to manage the macroeconomy, to keep the fluctuations in business cycles as small as possible and to keep the economy as close to its potential as possible. That can only be achieved through these demand side policies because it's only the aggregate demand that is under the sort of immediate control of the government and the central bank and the policymakers. So that is how, I am saying that they have the different roles. These demand side policies, they are there to manage the short run business cycles. They are sort of the tools with which you firefight and keep the economy in balance, close to its potential. Whereas the supply side policies, they are the ultimate long-term goals and they take time. They have got nothing to do with managing the country's business cycles. So if you have to control problem like inflation in the short run, go for these demand side policies. But the long run solution, the better solution is improve your country's productive capacity, because after many years you will have more GDP as well as lower price levels.